Hello, everyone, and welcome to International Organization. My name is Dr. Michael Rossi, and I'm absolutely delighted that you enrolled in this class with me. Now, I'm recording this lecture, even though we are meeting for the first time this Wednesday, for a couple of reasons. One, there is a graduate version of this class that does not meet until the following Monday, and I think I want to give them the same introduction that I give you undergrads. Two, there's a couple of you that are dialing in remotely, and I'm recording this before I actually go on campus to work the consoles. So I don't know if Zoom is going to work, and rather than finagle with it on the first day and have an absolute disaster, I figured I'm just going to record a lecture beforehand, so in the case the worst case scenario happens, I can just upload it to Blackboard and give it to those that are not in class. And three, because I want to test out this new approach that I've adopted this semester in light of COVID and the unconventional ways in which we're going to be learning over the next 14 to 15 weeks. International Organization is a class that is required for all of you international relations majors and is an important component for all poli-sci majors interested in learning more about international studies, the workings of the United Nations, and is just a real, interesting class, no matter what. I've taught it a number of times over the years at Rutgers, at TCNJ, and this is the first time that I'm offering it to all of you here at LIU. So with that said, let me explain what this course is, right? What is international organization? Well, it's a couple of things. The first, and probably the most important, is that it is an interdisciplinary study of international global governance. Right? There's your nice textbook definition here. And in this sense, this class will examine a number of international organizations: the UN, NATO, the European Union, Red Cross, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, the League of Nations, right? So you're going to learn all this stuff, right? You may know a little bit about these organizations. At the end of this class, you're going to know more than is, I think, even, healthy for, a young adult. But beyond just simply 1 week we do this, 1 week we do that, we're also going to be looking at how the world works and interacts. So the connection of these individual organizations will be linked to broader studies of institutionalism. Right? So, within the larger field of international relations, right, there's a big, component within studies of institutionalism, largely connected to the philosophies of liberalism that we're going to be looking at. So you're going to get your theory, you're going to get your practice, you're going to get your examples, you're going to get all of that. And then finally, in the most abstract way, we're going to be looking at global studies in an age of increasing interdependent problems and solutions. And so to that, we will be looking at the concept of international organization, right? So if you kind of, go back into the beginning of the title here, you'll note that the S is in parentheses, because that's basically what this class looks at. Specific international organizations, but also the larger theoretical concept of international organization, right? And that's studies of globalization, interdependency, transnational cooperation, a whole bunch of material that, is important in understanding how the world works, how the world operates, and why the world is as interdependent as it is in the 21st century. So, again, just to quickly go through some examples here, the international organizations that we will be looking at, as I mentioned, the United Nations is probably the most important, and we will be spending a good deal of time on that. The European Union, which I have a love-hate relationship with the EU, I see its function, but I also see it as just this increasingly bureaucratic behemoth. We're going to be looking at the ups and downs, the pros and cons of the EU. NATO, which is a pretty straightforward organization. It's just a, international military alliance. The World Bank, and by extension, the International Monetary Fund, because, we can't do, global studies without, economics. These are all institutions that are represented by state members. And these states carry, as much authority and give as much authority to these organizations as its members invest in them. So what I mean by this, and this is really the first lesson in this class, is that when we study international organizations, right, its members are not individuals, but states, right? Like the United Nations or the European Union or NATO, right? There are members like Germany or Great Britain or France or the United States or Russia or China or Somalia. And the states that comprise these organizations have the ability of giving as much power or limiting as much power as necessary to these organizations. So if you know something about the UN and, you're thinking, well, the UN is okay, but it doesn't really do much, or it kind of points out the problems, but it doesn't solve it, don't blame the UN. Blame the member states that limit the powers of the UN to, look at a problem, identify the problem, but not do much to solve that problem. Now, beyond the conventional cases, right, we're also going to be looking at non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, international regimes, and yes, even terrorist organizations. It's fair enough to say the Islamic State was an international organization. Al-Qaeda, in its heyday, had better organization and function than I think almost half the organizations out there. So yes, it's a survey class that looks at all of the IOs in the world today. But it is also, as I mentioned, a class that examines the concept of international organization. And in this case, right, we are not just looking at global governance because, in fact, it's rarely that, right? Again, spoiler alert here, we are not going to be headed towards any global government anytime soon, right? Not in my lifetime, and I'm pretty confident not in yours. So if you're thinking that this is a class that is going to be advocating for a world global government, it's not that I want it or not. It's just that it's infeasible. It's just not going to work in this day and age. And that's largely because, international organizations don't have the formal authority to enact policy, right, in the same way that states do. Right? Organizations like the UN can recommend. They might be able to pass a resolution here or there, but there's no enforcement. Right? That's kind of the other thing, is that IOs don't really have degrees of enforcement on the things that they pass. It's kind of up to the states to decide whether they want to abide by them or not. And, if your country is powerful enough to, buck the system, disregard precedent, well, you can do it. And I'm not just simply talking about the United States every so often going rogue. Russia does it. China does it, Israel does it, and then smaller, weaker countries like, Somalia or Egypt or Armenia, can't afford that luxury. So when we talk about international organization, we're not, talking about a governing body in that sense, but rather a multi-level collection of governance-related activities, rules, and mechanisms, both formal and informal. So there's a lot of normativity that goes into the understanding of international organization that is very relevant in this day and age. And what a time to be taking this course. We are looking at the concept of international organization amid, global pandemic. And, there's no sign that COVID is going to be letting up anytime soon. I don't know if you've been following the news here, but, most prognoses are that, COVID is going to be with us at least until sometime next year. And, if you, have family members that are working in the corporate world, especially the big banks or Google or Apple or whatever, corporate leadership basically told everybody, go home and stay home. And stay home indefinitely. I know people personally that are working for financial banking companies, and they're home throughout the rest of the year. They're going to revisit maybe going back to the offices as early as February, March of next year. So, with the, onset of, global pandemic, Not to mention the still persistent problems of climate change, global terrorism. Not as bad as it was a couple of years ago, but please do not think that, the Islamic State or things close enough or related to it are, over and done with. Economic turmoil. We're not just talking about, a housing crisis about to explode in New York, but, growing poverty around the world, growing inequalities, the scarcity of resources, both natural as well as financial. Hey, how about state collapse and civil wars? Again, people who have taken my classes usually end up getting depressed after a couple of my lectures. I'm sorry, I don't do this purposefully. I just kind of point out how crappy the world is sometimes. But, Syria, Libya, Yemen are just, three examples of this. As I'm recording this, there is an increasing likelihood that Turkey may go to war with Greece and by extension NATO over contested waters in the Mediterranean. How about the continued issue of mass migration and refugees? It's not just from the collapse of Syria, but unless pandemics and climate change are addressed sooner than later, we are going to see over the next few years hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people fleeing large parts of the world for more inhabitable areas. And, there's only so many spaces. There's only so much room that, certain places can handle. There's only so many resources and money and utilities and housing. Eventually, this is going to spill over into additional problems between communities, new challenges and new threats of state collapse. And, of course, the big perennial issue of human rights. Do human rights supersede, geographical state interest, resource allocation, what have you? Look, these are all issues that cannot be solved nor addressed by one country. They are clearly global challenges that require global solutions. And then, just finally, just the concept of global awareness, the idea that, we are part of one planet that has collective problems, environmental, financial, social, cultural. For most of the world, they probably already came to this realization. It's kind of now hitting the United States square center. Some of us kind of expected this to happen, and there are large parts of the country that are kicking and screaming that they now have to worry about, what happens in China might suddenly affect their ability at going out to eat at the local Arby's without a mask on. I mean, so the sobering reality that we are facing in the world today is that there is no one state that has the power, the authority, or the capability of solving any of these issues alone. Okay? Not the United States, not China, not Russia, not France, not Germany. There is not one country that could say to the rest of the world, guys, we got it. We'll take one for the team. We're going to handle it. Because these problems are transnational. And transnational problems require transnational cooperation. The United States could, pass the Green New Deal, which unfortunately with the two people that we have to choose from in November probably won't happen. But you know what? In a hypothetical situation, the U.S. passes the Green New Deal. And we get really, 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 adamant about enforcing environmental protection laws, right? We will charge you an arm and a leg at the local supermarket if you don't come with a burlap bag for your, groceries or whatever it is, right? Does that solve the larger issue of global climate problems? No, because what we do has very little impact on what China does in its own borders, or what India does, or what Brazil does. So unless the United States decides we're going to solve the global climate change crisis by literally taking over the planet, then it is more or less a global issue. And yet, here is where things get interesting. No institution other than states possess the ability to enact change. So if I've just been telling you that transnational problems require transnational cooperation, then you're thinking to yourself, okay, that's for the United Nations to worry about. That's for the World Trade Organization. That's for the European Union. I threw NATO in there just because everybody knows what NATO is. I don't think NATO can solve Green New Deal. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that IOs have the potential of reaching more areas around the world to address, but they don't have the individual ability to enact change. That is states alone. So there's a paradox that's already present, and we haven't even gotten through day one. And that is, international organizations have the capability of addressing global challenges and problems, but they lack the coercive ability to ensure said change is made. And at the same time, states possess the coercive power, but they lack the means outside of their sovereign control to enact change. So even the most well-intentioned state out there can only truly enact change within its own sovereign borders. If it wants other countries to play along, it has to use diplomacy, either coercion or bribes or alliances or whatever. But, even the most powerful state like the U.S. could maybe at best get, 24 states to go along, just operating through the U.S. State Department. And that does not even consider our current leadership or our potential, alternative leadership under Biden. So it's going to involve, really, the UN. It's going to involve the number of international treaties and protocols in order to enact said change. And so for that to happen, states like the US and China and Brazil and Germany and others have to pool their resources and delegate sovereignty towards some kind of international governance, right? That's really how international organizations operate. States will give up a fraction of their sovereignty and delegate it to an institution like the UN and give it the power necessary to enact that change. Hence the concept of global governance, not government, but global governance. Let me repeat, we are not going to have a global government in this, anytime soon, okay? Unless there's World War III and IV in my lifetime. The UN does not have the capability of becoming a global government, and the United States, among others, will never give the UN the power to become a global government. But governance, on the other hand, is already in the works. And taking this directly from your reading, okay, the Commission on Global Governance defines governance as the sum of the many ways individuals and institutions, public and private, manage their common affairs. It is a continuing process through which the conflicting or diverse interests may be accommodated and cooperative action may be taken. It includes formal as well as informal arrangements that people and institutions have agreed to or perceive to be in their interest. In so many words, ladies and gentlemen, global governance is effectively a subset of international relations. It is the way in which states communicate with other states, influencing, allying, coercing, preventing, and usually working through some organization like the UN or the EU or Red Cross or WTO, whatever it is, in order to get these things done. So in order to break through this paradox, states that have the ability to enact change need to use international organizations as a tool to make that change happen. Okay? And that is why global governance is so important in this day and age, right? And there are really four factors over the past 30 years or so that have made global governance a critical necessity for international relations today. This is also mentioned in the first chapter of your textbook, and it's worth just, recapping just briefly here. I begin with the end of the Cold War. And, I realize that for the vast majority of you, The Cold War might as well be ancient history, right? You have no working knowledge of the Soviet Union. You have no working knowledge of life in the 70s or the 80s, or even the 90s for that matter. But don't worry. Don't worry. I'm going to give you the necessary background in this class. The reason why the end of the Cold War is so important is not because Soviet Union collapsed or communism as a workable political theory, came apart, but that the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the communist power monopoly in Eastern Europe ended a bipolar arrangement of power that had defined the world for the previous 45 years. Right? So from roughly 1945 to 1990, right, the world was dominated by two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And while the two were antagonistic towards each other, they had kind of, agreed to work within this tacit arrangement in which each side recognizes the other's sphere of influence, barring a Latin American or Southeast Asian country that, fights a proxy war here or there. But when the Soviet Union collapses, that bipolar arrangement ends. And for, I would say, roughly a decade, the United States, sort of emerges as a hegemonic unipolar power. Right? The United States was the global superpower. And we'll talk about unipolarism, bipolarism, multipolarism throughout the semester. But suffice to say, unipolar powers, they don't last long, because they just don't have the resources to continue to be a global hegemon. After a certain point, other powers rise. But in that period, folks, the United States was very, very strategic in implementing a couple of ideas, chief of which was transnational economic interdependency, and some type of international society that the United States designs. So the U.S. has left its mark on the way in which foreign policy is conducted today. And so even in the wake of American hegemony, which was given a major blow on 9/11, and I think it's safe to say that the United States really ceased to be a unipolar power as early as 2008, 2009 with the economic recession. And, with Donald Trump and Joe Biden right now, we are a major power, don't get me wrong. But we are no longer the only power in the world. We now have to share that top tier with a couple of other countries, China being the most obvious, Russia coming in a, healthy third, Brazil, India, Iran. These are all important countries now. The United States is not alone at the top. And so the fact that there are new emerging countries necessitates some type of global governance to keep some semblance of order and organization. Now, to that, we add a second factor, and that's globalization. One of the things that the United States was very strategic in driving in the 90s was this idea of transnational global integration, which, when people think about globalization, they think really about economics, right? Transnational businesses, the spread of companies like Microsoft and Coca-Cola and McDonald's. But in many cases, globalization is more than just that. Globalization is, at its core, the dissemination of beliefs, ideas, trends, and information to previously disconnected groups and societies. And if the United States is at the forefront of that, the U.S. is driving globalization to effectively promote its own interests, economic, political, and social, around the world. Now, that's not to say that globalization is Americanization, but I think it's fair enough to say that international culture today draws heavily from American culture. Right? It draws from Japan and South Korea and the Middle East and other places as well. But globalization is also a way of bringing the world together into a smaller global community that, again, needs some kind of governance, some kind of regulation. The third element is technological advancement, which is it goes along with globalization. But the idea that, the world is operating faster, cheaper, and increasingly automated. Now, the fact that I am able to record a lecture and upload it to a server without the server crashing is something that I can do in 2020. I would not be able to do back in 2000 when I started grad school. The idea that some of you are listening to this lecture right now through your smartphone also implies technological advancement, right? If some of you remember the early days of cell phones, remember the old clam flip phones or whatever it is, right? The most you can do on those old Nokias was play Snake or whatever it is. Now, right, I just got a new smartphone last week. I mean, that camera is better than the big, SLR camera that I have when I take when I take pictures. The point here is that technological advancement is not just the addition of new gadgets, but it's also the democratization of information, the spread of the internet, and the idea that people can find whatever they want without governmental restrictions, barring a China or a Turkey, preventing you from finding out certain things. But, YouTube, Twitter, social media has been instrumental in driving riots, revolutions, and protests against entrenched governments. They have been instrumental in unearthing a plethora of disingenuous criminal activities that states, have committed. I mean, you remember WikiLeaks in this case, right? This idea that, the United States is upset at Edward Snowden for effectively bringing to light all the corruption and dirty deeds that people previously kept hidden from U.S. citizens. In this day and age, global governance is going to be needed to provide some kind of control, some kind of regulation, some kind of management over this technological advancement. The thing that I've just found recently that I got to be very, very wary about, I don't know how many of you have heard about this, deepfake. How many of you have heard of deepfake before? Where, some real savvy computer programmers, whatever it is, are able to digitally paste someone's face onto a video of someone without that person ever being there, but making it look really, really realistic, right? I mean, we can certainly talk about this as the semester progresses, but at some point there's going to have to be some laws on these things, right? And then finally, just the general expansion of transnationalism. With everything that we've just described in the previous three elements here, transnationalism is basically where we are in 2020. The state has lost its monopoly on information, power, identity, and authority. Now, I don't want to say that the state is going away. The state will not abolish, right? So if there's any anarchists in the room, I hate to break it to you, not anytime soon. The state just no longer has a monopoly on that information. Right? Increasingly, right, we get our news, we get our information from sources around the world. We talk to people, we talk to friends online through Skype, through Zoom, through Facebook, without paying long-distance calls. The effects that non-state actors now have across state boundaries. I know more about the comings and goings of politics in Eastern Europe today than I do in Pennsylvania. Just simply because, I wrote a paper on the, parliamentary elections in Slovakia over the summer. And if anybody of you wants to hear about me give you a hot take on that, trust me, all I got to do is ask. But it's like, if I want to find out about news in Slovakia or Serbia or Greece, I just go on the internet, right? I can ask my friends. I can, just go on YouTube, whatever it is, right? Truly, we are in the creation of a global civil society. Yeah, we all have passports with our countries. We still have flags that we salute, and we're not going to take a bullet yet for the UN flag. But we don't feel that we are exposed to the world through one national lens, right? And there are many of you that are taking this class who are coming from other countries, right? So you are part of that expanding transnational phenomenon. Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? So with all of this, right, who are the actors in global governance? Primarily, and as far as I can say for the foreseeable future, states still remain the primary actors, although they are no longer the only actors. And when we talk about states, sovereign states, large states, small states, strong, weak, failed, countries that have certain capabilities have their own unique ways of leaving their mark in the international arena. Now, it's fair enough to say countries like China, Russia, and the United States are going to have a little bit more leeway in doing what they want and getting away with what they want than, let's say, Haiti or Costa Rica or the Philippines or Bhutan, for that matter. But still, states with their relative capabilities, some will overlook the policies of international organizations, and others will rely extensively on these organizations because it's their only way of broadcasting their identity and their interests to the rest of the world. So the United States can kind of look at the UN, and, we are, I would say, about a couple of days, a week, I don't know, or so away from the annual General Assembly meeting where every delegate from every country goes into the UN and offers a little speech here or there. Trump may phone it in, I don't know. He may not even come, who knows? He doesn't really care. The president of Slovakia will use that opportunity to address the world in the 20 minutes that she has, and that may be the one time that the rest of the world sees her and hears her. And so the role of intergovernmental organizations is also a primary factor within our study of global governance. But like I had said before, IGOs are only as powerful and as influential as the member states make them out to be. And then, depending upon their role, they could be, global like the UN, regional like the EU, or sub-regional like, NAFTA in that sense, right? I mean, they certainly are part of our study. And they, form kind of like a fourth branch of analyses that we're going to look at, very, very quickly here. Non-governmental organizations like Red Cross or Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders, they don't have the same degree of clout as the UN does, but they're very good at formulating policy and influencing the way certain countries act. In fact, I'm going to, give away within the next few weeks here my proclivity for Amnesty International. You think these guys don't really have much say. Oh, Amnesty International is pretty influential on the global market because they give an image of how a country acts towards its people, towards its neighbors, and that image will determine whether a corporation wants to invest money in that country or not, right? I mean, it's like, look, if you have, let's say, $10 million that you want to invest around the world, you're going to put your money in Switzerland or Nigeria. And if you're all saying Switzerland, good for you. You know that your money's going to be there in 10 years. You give your money to Nigeria, you might get some of it back, you might get none of it back. Who knows? It's the way in which countries are seen by others. Non-governmental organizations are very good at providing this brand image of countries. We also have to look at multinational corporations. I mean, these aren't governments. These aren't governing organizations. But look, I hate to admit this. Jeff Bezos probably has more clout in the world today than the UN General Secretary. He also has more money than I think the UN ever could possibly hope to have. But, Amazon, Microsoft, Coca-Cola, Nike, McDonald's. I mean, some of these corporations have more annual revenue than the gross domestic product of the developing world. I mean, if Microsoft really wanted to, they could buy about a quarter of Africa and just turn it into a glorified business park. There was for a brief moment in 2004, Coca-Cola set up a bottling factory in Mogadishu, Somalia. And, prior to the next civil war that broke out, it was pretty successful because they just bought, I think, 3 or 4 different warlord groups and turned 2 into security. One gets night shift, the other one gets the day shift. One becomes management, and the other one drives the trucks, and they're all paid by Coca-Cola, so what do they care? It's fantastic. And finally, in the more obscure things, actors in global governance can also be individual experts and policymakers. So if you're listening to all of this and you're thinking to yourself, I would absolutely love to be one of those big policy wonks that goes on TV or those Sunday morning talk shows or gives a speech at Davos or offers consulting to, UN groups. Well, this class may very well be an opening in that. And as a shameless plug for the international program, we are working very diligently in building a professional development aspect of our major that kind of sets you up on the career path. So yes, there are goals for the individual to enact influence and policy. But again, they have to, sort of play deference to, the three or four groups, up above. As a way of putting this into some kind of visual format, within studies of international relations, there are really three levels of analysis. The international level, which is, the most chaotic. It's the global level. There's really no one there other than the states making it up. And the states usually have the most authority, the most control, and the most influence. And of course, traditionally speaking, states are comprised of citizens, subjects, whatever it is that you want. Now, in classic IR theory, folks, it's really the second level, the state level, that's the most important. Because it's here where sovereign authority is located. And traditionally, that sovereign authority kind of shapes and designs, the nature and the outlook and the beliefs of their own citizens, which, prior to Facebook or Skype, citizens of different countries rarely interacted with citizens of other countries, right? You interacted really with your own. The occasional phone call to your grandparents in Austria and, a $20 phone bill later, that was about it. You did that maybe once every couple of months. It was really states that interacted with other states, right, through diplomatic relations and other elements. This is somewhat of an outdated model of IR today, especially when we throw in international organizations. We throw in the concept of globalization, transnational technology, and well, things kind of become a little bit more crowded. The role of institutions and the role of global communication kind of broke the monopoly of what states used to have. Yeah, they're still there, but institutions now serve as a great way of being a middle area between the chaos of the international level by itself and, the individual ideas, goals, and missions of states. So institutions, what do? They provide a forum of, for states to, air out their grievances. In the olden days, State A disagreed with what State B did. They went to war, and whoever won the war, continued the narrative. Today, we have institutions that prevent Greece and Turkey from going to war. And if the EU gets its act together, we may avoid this. But increasingly also institutions bypass states and reach for the individuals, right? Especially if you're an individual living in Europe, you've got access to the European Union. You don't like what your country is doing? You can go to the EU. You can go to your local EU office or whatever it is and say, hey, my country is not abiding by certain principles or regulations, blah, blah, blah. And you could take your country to task. You could interact with other countries. You could interact with individuals from other countries. You see how things operate these days. Institutions are kind of necessary to keep things in some kind of order. Okay? And all of this will, be clearer as we progress within this class. So what kind of questions are we going to be asking? What are we going to be looking at in the next, 14, 15 weeks here? The primary question, and this is one that we will probably visit at least once a week. Why do states join organizations? Why would states delegate a portion of their sovereign decision-making to an external institution? What do states get out of this arrangement? And, as a follow-up question to that, who benefits? Right? If we were to follow the individual theories of IR, and we continue with the idea that states are the primary actor, they will make or break international organizations and international organization. What's their interest in working with international organizations? And to that, who designs policy? Because if the states are the ones that are the movers and the shakers and the wheelers and dealers, there are some countries that are much more active in designing policy than others. The United States, China, and even Russia are probably going to author more articles, more treaties than, let's say, the Central African Republic. Okay? And then how are policies enforced? The UN does not have the element of enforcement. The EU doesn't have the element really of enforcement. So how do we get states, even powerful states, to go along with things that if left to their own devices, they may be like, yeah, I can, do it myself. Look, the United States, bypassed the UN Security Council multiple times when it wanted to go to war, right? The first time was in '99, where the UN prohibited conflict with Yugoslavia, Serbia. The United States said, hey, we got the military, we can do that. Same thing happened in '03 when we invaded Iraq. Same thing happened with Libya in 2011, 2012. Are there consequences, right? What are those consequences? Sometimes those consequences don't reveal themselves for years, decades later on, right? So what does this class emphasize? Okay? What are some of the specific things that we're going to be learning alongside asking? The first thing is this class will emphasize a growing need to address the prevalence and influence of non-state actors in the international arena. In other words, the UN might have a lot of problems, but it's damn important. The EU might be a big bureaucratic behemoth, but for the small number of countries in Europe that have not yet entered, they want to enter. That's got to say something, right? For NATO, which seems to have expanded to its natural borders, there is still the possibility of including Ukraine and Georgia. And what's the fallout from that from Russia? The second thing, how states rely on international organization as a means of reaching collective consensus, reducing uncertainty, and enforcing international policy. In other words, how international organization resolves conflict, avoids war, and creates, even in a smaller area, a sense of global interdependency. How the European Union, when it first started, eliminated the threat of war ever again between Germany and France. The first half of the 20th century, second half of the 19th, you could set your watch to whenever Germany invaded France. It usually happened, once a generation or whatever. Today, the countries' economies are so intertwined that there are few countries in the world today that I could actually see as less likely to go to war than Germany and France. Is this just because the countries started thinking differently? Or is it because the international organizations that they are a part of kind of force them to comply to the point where at some point cooperation is just too good to break? And finally, we're going to be looking at the often contentious relationship between sovereign states and international institutions. A country that is powerful enough to buck the system is going to try to do it. And that's why the United States today is seen, interestingly enough, as one of the most belligerent and dangerous countries in the world. Not Iran, not Saudi Arabia, not China, not Russia, but the United States. And that is largely because the U.S. feels that it still has not just the authority, but the moral legitimacy to do what it wants on its own. That's problematic. And it's not going to go away if Trump is removed from office at the end of this year. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that the United States risks becoming even more belligerent under a Biden administration. We can talk about that throughout the semester as well. What this class does not emphasize is, well, a few things that I've already brought up. Number one, don't expect me trying to push on you the creation of a world government. Okay, we will not get a Supreme Chancellor Palpatine in our lifetime, right? It's not going to happen. Okay, the UN General Secretary has no authority, no power to make that. And as much as people would like to sometimes think about either Trump, Putin, or Xi Jinping trying to go for broke and become, world leader, that's just not going to happen. This class also does not emphasize the prevalence of international law over sovereign states. And I'm not saying that because I disregard international law. I'm saying it because sovereign states still have the ability of ignoring international law. So, yeah, there's a lot of textbooks that will tell you how awesome and how important international law is. But open up a newspaper, click on any news website, and you'll find that a sovereign state bucks that system all the time. This class will not also give any false optimism for global peace. When I taught this class initially in 2005, I might have been a bit more optimistic. In 2020, I'm not saying we're headed towards a world war. I'm just saying that I would rather put my money on stability than peace. We got a lot of problems, and we are going to be dealing with a lot of new unconventional problems in the coming years. That is going to make this planet anything but peaceful. And finally, as much as this class emphasizes the importance, the function, and the utility of international organizations, I will not tell you that they are a panacea for all the world's problems. They are very good at identifying problems and coming up with solutions. But at the end of the day, states will be the ones to make or break the future of this world. And they will do so through international organizations. But it is the states, again, that possess the agency to make the world better or increasingly problematic. Just before we leave, I would like to just give a little shout out, a little shameless plug to my YouTube page. Yes, for those of you who don't know, I have an honest-to-God working YouTube page, Michael Rossi, Poli-Sci. And the reason why I bring this up is because there are a number of videos already there within the study of international relations that you are welcome to view, especially when we review theories, realism, liberalism, constructivism. They're not required for this class, but if you have not taken a class in formal IR theory, and we will talk about a few of these things in this class, but you want a little bit more supplementary information, I welcome you to my page, which currently is approaching 4,000 subscribers. So this is a legit page, folks. And some of these videos have over 38,000 views. So I've been doing this for quite a while, and I may even put these videos up on YouTube, once class, is moving. So with that said, I think that is a great way to stop our introduction. I hope that what I had covered is enough to keep you interested and motivated in staying in this class, especially for those who are non-poli-sci majors. I definitely would like to include you in the learning process. If you have any particular questions about the reading or the assignments, we can certainly talk about them on the first day, or we can always have an informal Zoom meeting. You do know that there was one book that you need to purchase. I have read through it. It's the third edition. The authors kind of got the message, and they made it a little bit more interesting the third time around. So I'm not a fan of textbooks because they can be jargonistic, and they kind of tend to overkill. But, I'm also going to teach you how to, skim through the chapters to get the important stuff out. But a lot of the material is going to be here in the video lectures. You are still responsible for doing the readings, but we're going to be, taking the high points of that within these video lectures. So, starting next week, we will meet on Monday only. So what I would like for you to have completed by then is I would like for you to have read Chapter 1 in the Carnes, Minkst, and Stiles book. Chapter 2 covers the theories, and I really would like for you to focus more on the sections of realism, liberalism, and constructivism. But you can also look at my YouTube videos to get a general sense. And I will have another lecture video that talks about that. And if you could also, for next Monday, at least start Chapter 3, IGOs and the Foundations of Global Governance, right? We got a lot of stuff to work with because we got to get through this first week, but I would like for you, if you can, to have Chapters 2 and 3 read for next week, and I will have the next set of videos up for the weekend as well. So when we do meet in class on next Monday, we'll have some things to talk about. And I would like for you to, bring in your own thoughts, your own reflections, and your own ideas into the discussion as well. All right, so anyway, welcome aboard here. Please, everyone, stay healthy, stay happy, and most importantly, stay sane. You have any questions about accommodations, let me know. There's a number of you that are already taking this class remotely. If some of you want to make that transition, I am fine with that. You are safe in this class because if we all gravitate online anyway in the next coming weeks, as most universities do, we don't have to change anything over. The lectures will already be available online, and we'll just have our meetings, our Monday meetings on Zoom all together. So one final time, welcome to the class, and I look forward to working with you over the next 14 weeks.